It was an October morning in 1990, and the narrow streets of the neighborhood were busier than usual. Neighbors came and went, some carrying shopping bags, others pausing in their doorways to talk about the wedding that was about to take place. Rosilene dos Santos, 19 years old, had woken before the sun. She had a quiet coffee with her mother and younger siblings while the wind slipping through the cracks of the wooden house made the plastic tablecloth dance. The wedding dress lay carefully folded on the bed, protected by a clean sheet. It wasn't new, but it was precious. It had been a gift from a neighbor who had married a few years earlier, altered with pieces of lace that Rosilene had sewn on by the light of a kerosene lamp. The sleeves had been tailored and the hem shortened so it wouldn't drag on the ground. Beside it lay a makeshift bouquet crafted from flowers picked in the yard, their stems bound together with a piece of string. Antônio Luiz da Conceição, 23 and a bricklayer's assistant, was in another part of the neighborhood preparing to put on a suit borrowed from a friend. It was a dark ensemble, slightly too large for his lean frame, with a lapel that was beginning to fray. He adjusted the tie in the cracked mirror of an acquaintance's house, trying to get the knot just right. His light-colored shirt was neatly pressed, and his shoes, though old, had been polished the night before. The plan was simple. Rosilene would go to a friend's house to get ready, and Antonio would stop by to pick her up. From there, they would walk together to the corner of the main street where Cláudio's Kombi van would be waiting. He would then drive them to the small church in the center of Recife, where family and friends were already beginning to gather. That morning, the neighborhood seemed to breathe with anticipation. Barefoot children ran along the dirt road, a radio played old forró music at high volume, and from Dona Maria's yard came the smell of cassava cake baking in a wood-fired oven. The neighbors remarked that despite all their hardships, this couple deserved a special day. Rosilene was known for her kindness and her skill with a needle. Antonio, for his calm nature and his dedication to his work. Shortly before 9, Rosilene put on the dress and glanced at herself in the small mirror on the wall. She offered a faint smile but said nothing. She picked up her shoes, a simple white pair, and placed them in a cloth bag to put on later, to keep them from getting dirty on the way. She left the house with the dress covered by a thin sheet. Shielding the fabric from the dust, her mother, standing in the doorway, simply wished her good luck, her eyes welling with tears. Antonio, meanwhile, was already on his way, walking with long strides as he felt the sun begin to warm the day. He greeted an acquaintance on the corner and hurried toward the meeting point. Cláudio's white Kombi was parked there, the driver leaning against the door, smoking and checking his watch. But what had seemed like a predictable morning began to take on a strange hue. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour, and neither Rosilene nor Antonio appeared. Cláudio found it odd, but figured they were dealing with some last-minute detail. Finally, he decided to go look for them. First, he stopped by Rosilene's mother's house, where he learned she had left early. Then he went to the address where Antonio was getting ready, only to be told he had left more than half an hour ago. When he returned to the corner, the Kombi was still empty under the harsh midday sun. The rhythm of the neighborhood began to change. The guests at the church exchanged confused glances. And at the door of the small wooden house, Rosilene's mother began to feel that something was not right. That feeling, still just a quiet whisper, would become an endless void in the days to come. Cláudio was slow to admit something was wrong. He drove the Kombi through streets he had known since he was a boy, giving short honks in front of houses, asking anyone he saw. No one had seen Rosilene since mid-morning. As for Antonio, they said he had passed by in a hurry, his light shirt neatly pressed, looking like a man eager to arrive. With every denial, Cláudio's anxiety grew. He returned to the corner to wait a little longer, his fingers gripping the steering wheel, listening to the crackle of the radio reporting on traffic and soccer, as if it were just another ordinary day. In the church, a pair of godparents held the wedding rings and exchanged uneasy looks. The priest paced back and forth, consulting his watch and his calendar of baptisms. Rosaline's mother, who had arrived with her younger children, sat in the front pew staring at the empty aisle where her daughter was meant to walk. The silence was broken only by the grinding of the ceiling fan and the muffled sound of cars outside. A relative suggested going back to the neighborhood to search. Another insisted they wait a little longer, but time inside the church had begun to feel like a stagnant lake. Cláudio parked the Kombi and decided to split the search with two neighbors. The heat clung to their skin and the dust from the dirt road made their throats burn. They knocked on doors and ventured into alleys where the smell of the mangrove swamp, a mix of salt and refuse, hung heavy in the air. They asked hot dog vendors, men drinking beer on the sidewalk, and housewives hanging sheets on the line. Someone claimed to have seen a young woman in a light-colored dress crossing the street in a hurry, holding a bag. Another swore that Antônio had taken a shortcut behind an abandoned warehouse near the port. The stories diverged, just like the couple's own footsteps. By afternoon, the church had emptied. The cake waiting in the refrigerator at Rosaline's mother's house remained untouched. The smell of shredded coconut and condensed milk, which should have symbolized celebration, became a reminder of what had not happened. As the sun began to set, the neighborhood's mood shifted again. Less curious, more worried. Rosaline's mother held the makeshift bouquet her daughter had left on the table, squeezing the flowers until the string bit into her fingers. Her middle son went out into the street, calling his sister's name as if calling for a lost dog. The night brought a damp wind from the sea, the kind of gust that slams wooden doors and whistles through the cracks. Exhausted, Cláudio went to the police station to file a missing persons report. He told them about the scheduled time, the addresses, the delay that had turned into an absence. He filled out paperwork, describing the simple dress, the borrowed suit, the Kombi that never made it to the church. He didn't know any difficult words, he just told it the way he knew how, straight and simple. He returned home with no answers, his head aching. He did not sleep. The next morning, neighbors formed small groups. Some followed the most logical route to the city center, past broken sidewalks and patches of sparse grass, checking bus stops where people shielded themselves from the sun with newspapers. Others scoured vacant lots, backyards, and the area around the port. The sound of the tide crashing against the rocks seemed to mock their efforts. Later that afternoon, the news spread. A pair of white, round-toed shoes had been found placed neatly against a wall in a narrow alley that connected two streets. They were clean, perfectly aligned, as if someone had calmly taken them off and left them there. Rosaline's mother recognized them. They were the shoes her daughter was meant to wear at the church. She held each one as if it were a shell pulled from the bottom of the sea, examining the unblemished leather, the sturdy laces. There was no mud, not a single scratch. Beside them there was nothing. No bag, no piece of cloth, no note. The strangeness of the detail deepened the hollow feeling in everyone's stomach. Some whispered it looked like a message. Others, more practical, said it could be a coincidence. But in the heart of that neighborhood, coincidences were rarely so perfect. From that point on, the theories began to multiply. An old woman swore she had seen an unknown man lurking around the houses a few days earlier. A thin man with his shirt unbuttoned who stared too long. A young man spoke of a small boat that had docked the night before the wedding, its lights off, and then departed. Cláudio sifted through his memories, searching for a forgotten detail, a conversation that might make sense. Did Antônio have enemies? Not that he knew of. Was Rosilene afraid of someone? She had never said. As he jotted down addresses on scraps of paper, the tin roofs of the houses creaked in the heat. Claudio leaned against his Kombi, looked out at the empty street, and for the first time felt a real and chilling fear. What happens to two people who have a clear destination in the morning, and by nightfall have become nothing more than a rumor? Rosaline's mother tried to keep the house in order, sweeping the packed earth floor, washing the dishes as if each clean plate were a way to keep her daughter close. From time to time, the smell of rain would rise from the earth, that scent of wet soil that ignites a small flicker of hope. But the rain would pass and take the hope with it. The following days piled up into a thick silence. The wedding cake was divided into small portions and distributed among the neighbors, because no one could bear to see that sweet mass taking up space in the refrigerator any longer. Eating it was painful, but it was also a way not to let it go to waste. At the church, the priest noted the date in his ledger, wrote "no ceremony held," and went on with his routine of masses. The city, too large to feel the absence of two names, kept on turning. But in the neighborhood, every corner was haunted by the ghost of a journey that was never completed. By the end of the week, all that remained was the realization that no one wanted to admit. It was not a delay, not a mix-up. It was the beginning of a disappearance. And disappearances in places like that leave their marks not on the ground, but on those who remain. In the eyes of a mother who watches the street through a crack in the door, in the calloused hands of a friend who insists on driving the route one more time, in the thread of hope that refuses to break. As the weeks passed, the absence of Rosilene and Antônio went from being a shock to an open wound. The neighborhood, Brasilia Teimosa, accustomed to the ebb and flow of the sea and the hustle of the port, began to carry an uncomfortable silence in its conversations. On the sidewalks, people spoke of the case as they might the weather, lowering their voices, looking over their shoulders, and ending their sentences with a sigh. The children, who once played wedding in their yards, began to repeat without fully understanding that a bride and groom could simply vanish. Rosaline's mother, now thinner, her hair always tied back, avoided leaving the house. She would only go to the corner store for essentials and return quickly, as if the world outside were a constant threat. Claudio continued to drive by the spot where the Kombi was supposed to have waited, almost every day. He would park for a few minutes, light a cigarette, and stare at the cracked pavement, trying to imagine where the story had been so abruptly severed. He was haunted by the image of the white shoes in the alley, too clean for someone who would have walked those streets of dirt and sand. The police, after the initial report, made a few visits to the area, but the pace of the investigation slowed. An officer or two would ask if there had been any disagreements, any debts, any bar fights, or threats received before the wedding. The answers were always the same: nothing. Rosilene lived for her family and her work with a needle and thread. Antônio for his odd jobs and the dream of one day owning a brick house. No known enemies, no unsettled scores. In the neighborhood, theories took root. Some spoke of a kidnapping, pointing to stories of other disappearances in the city. Others imagined the couple had decided to run away for some reason no one could explain. But for those who knew them, the idea didn't stick. The two had spoken of their wedding with a light in their eyes. They didn't seem to want a life anywhere else. The weeks turned into months. The absence made itself known in small details. The borrowed dress was never returned to its owner. The suit was left forgotten at Antonio's friend's house, beside a shirt already yellowed with time. The makeshift bouquet, which the mother had kept in a glass jar, withered until it was just a dry tangle of brittle stems and petals. The younger siblings stopped asking where their sister was, as if silence itself had taught them there was no answer. At the end of 1990, Christmas was silent. Faint lights blinked in some of the neighborhood windows, But in the Santos family home, there were no decorations. The plate of couscous stuffing and the roasted chicken were placed on the table like any other meal. The radio played songs of reunion, but no one had the courage to speak of it. Antonio was also remembered by the few relatives he had left in the neighborhood who, with no news, had learned to avoid asking about the case so as not to reopen the wound. Time moved on, and in 1993, the official word came. The investigation was closed. A cold, indifferent piece of paper, its few lines declaring there was not enough evidence to proceed. For anyone who read it, it seemed like an ending. But in the neighborhood, everyone knew the case had no end. It was one of those voids in the collective memory that continued to pull at conversations, especially on rainy days, when people retreated indoors early and the night seemed to stretch on forever. Osmar Ferreira, a veteran fisherman, remembered that time well. Back then, he worked with small nets, selling his catch at the local market. He passed through the Tajipio River almost every day. He knew its stones and the whims of its tide like the back of his own hand. He had no direct connection to Rosilene or Antônio, but, like nearly every resident, he knew the story by heart. The engaged couple who vanished, the shoes in the alley. No trace after that. He found the story sad but also as unsolvable as water slipping through his fingers. In the years that followed, life in the neighborhood carried on with the same hardships. Simple houses of wood and makeshift masonry, dirt roads that turned to mud in the winter, and the constant sound of waves mingling with the hum of boat engines. But for the older residents, the story of Rosilene and Antônio was a disquieting reminder that sometimes the sea isn't the only thing that swallows people without a trace. Conversations in the street-side bars were divided between soccer, politics, and the one question that never found an answer. And that couple, I wonder if... The end of the sentence always hung in the air, as if completing it were too dangerous. As the decade turned, new families moved in, unaware of the story, and the old residents took it upon themselves to tell it, sometimes in a near whisper, so that the disappearance would not be forgotten. It was like a scar that no longer ached every day, but one that no one wanted to see fade from memory. The year 2001 arrived in the neighborhood like any other. The same tides brought the smell of fresh fish in the early hours. The same boats moored at the improvised pier. The same voices echoed between the wooden houses. Osmar Ferreira, then 61, maintained a routine he had repeated for decades. He would wake before the sun, check the nets stored in a corner of his yard, and guide his boat along the Tajipio, watching the current and seeking the spots where the fishing was most plentiful. On the May morning that would change everything, the weather was overcast. A gray sky mirrored in the water's surface, and the tide was lower than usual, exposing rocks that were hidden on most days. The river flowed lazily, the sound of oars slicing through the water mixing with the distant crowing of roosters. Osmar was in no hurry. He knew that with the low tide he might find fish trapped among the stones. It was then, as he approached a rocky stretch, that he noticed something out of place. Between two large, moss-covered rocks lay a brown suitcase, its fabric worn, half swallowed by the water. Its faded color blended with the green of the algae, but its rectangular shape was unmistakable. The gentle current made the suitcase sway, and its lid was partly open, revealing a sodden, light-colored fabric. Osmar carefully brought his boat alongside, balancing himself to avoid slipping on the damp rocks. He pulled the suitcase out with some effort. Its weight told him it was full of water. The rusted latch gave way easily. Inside, the fisherman found a simple wedding dress, yellowed and stained with mold, its fabric frayed and dissolving at the edges. Beside it, carefully folded, was a dark suit, equally deteriorated, its fibers weakened by time and water. Osmar, who was not a superstitious man, felt a chill crawl up his spine. The clothes had an old-fashioned air, and the contrast between the care with which they were folded and the abandonment in which they were found was unsettling. He called over two other fishermen who were further down the river. The three men gathered in silence around the suitcase, sharing the unspoken understanding that this was no ordinary river debris. It wasn't long before one of them mentioned that years ago a couple had disappeared on their wedding day, and that the clothes described at the time matched those now before them. Osmar decided not to touch the items any further and called the police from a public phone on the riverbank. The arrival of the squad car drew a crowd of onlookers. Local residents drew near, craning their necks to see the suitcase's contents, whispering among themselves. Some of the older ones made an immediate connection to Rosilene and Antônio. The police collected the suitcase, improvising by placing the clothes in large plastic bags. One of the forensic officers remarked that it would be nearly impossible to determine exactly how long the object had been in the river, but its decay pointed to years of submersion. On his way back, Osmar couldn't stop thinking about the moment he had pulled the suitcase from the water. The feeling wasn't one of relief nor of fear. It was as if he had, without meaning to, opened a door to a past the neighborhood had tried to leave behind. When he got home, he moored his boat, sat on the porch bench, and stared at the river in the distance. He knew that from this day forward the story he heard in bars and on street corners would once again fill the air, now with a new piece of the puzzle, a piece that didn't explain everything, but one that no one could ignore. The news tore through the neighborhood like a storm wind. Before the afternoon was over, some were already stating with certainty that the clothes belonged to Rosilene and Antônio. Others urged caution, pointing out that there were no documents or direct proof. But even among the most skeptical, it was hard not to feel the symbolic weight of the discovery. The suitcase from the river seemed to bring back not only the mystery but also the pain of those who never got an answer. And in the quiet moments between one comment and the next, Brasilia Teimosa began to ask itself again what had truly happened on that October 12, 1990. At the police station, the brown suitcase was placed on a scratched metal table, under the yellowish light of a bulb that swayed slightly in the breeze from an open window. The officers opened the rusted latch again, carefully removing the dress and the suit. The fibers were fragile, shedding small particles of fabric that clung to their latex gloves. The smell that rose was a mixture of mold, stagnant water, and something indefinable, as if each fiber had stored a piece of the river. One agent took quick notes while another photographed the garments. The dress, despite its decay, still had lace details on the sleeves and hem, exactly as Rosilene's mother had described at the time of the disappearance. The suit, with its simple cut and narrow lapel, showed signs of wear on the shoulders and lining, confirming it hadn't been new even before it was submerged. The clothes were placed in transparent bags and sealed with evidence tags, but for many there no doubt remained. These were the garments of the missing couple. The news soon reached the family. Rosilene's mother was asked to identify the items, but she hesitated. She had spent more than a decade avoiding any concrete reminder of that day. When she finally approached, she couldn't bring herself to touch the clothes. She just stood there, looking from a distance, her breath shallow, as if seeing the dress was to relive the moment her daughter had left home for the last time. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry out. There was only a silent, slow nod of confirmation. The presence of the suitcase reignited a kind of energy in the neighborhood. But it was not one of hope. It was one of restlessness. In the bars, conversations that had been interrupted by time resumed. One neighbor swore he had seen a strange boat near the bank that week in 1990. Another recalled a tall man in a hat who had asked for directions to the city center and was never seen again. The stories were fragments with no clear connection, but they all seemed to find a place in the shadow of the recovered suitcase. Osmar, the fisherman, became an unwilling central figure. Residents stopped him on the street to hear his account of finding the suitcase. He would repeat the story step by step from the moment he saw the object wedged in the rocks to the arrival of the police. He always stressed that he hadn't disturbed it more than necessary, as if to make it clear that he had respected whatever it was he had found. At night, sitting on his doorstep, he received visits from the curious. Some came merely out of interest, others came because they still carried questions they hadn't asked in years. The police, faced with the public reaction, decided to organize searches around the stretch of river where the suitcase was found. Divers scoured the shallow bottom, turning over stones coated in slime and thick mud. They found pieces of rotten wood, rusted cans, and torn nets, but nothing that could be directly linked to the case. The banks were also explored, the tall grass hiding the remnants of campfires, broken bottles, even an old, abandoned oar. None of it, however, brought any answers. Meanwhile, the suitcase was examined by experts. The internal seams were giving way, and the waterlogged lining had dark stains. They concluded that while it was impossible to determine the exact time it had been in the river, it had likely been there for several years. The position in which it was found, wedged between rocks, suggested it might have been placed there or become trapped during a flood, forgotten until that day's low tide. The neighborhood reacted in different ways. For some, the suitcase was proof enough that something terrible had happened. Perhaps a crime, perhaps an accident. For others, it was just a distant echo incapable of bringing certainty. But everyone agreed on one thing: the story had once again taken up space in the present. In the days that followed, there wasn't a corner or a sidewalk where the subject didn't arise, followed by the kind of silence that falls when imagination begins to fill in the gaps of a story. After seeing the dress, Rosaline's mother began to light a candle every night, letting it burn down to nothing on her kitchen table. She said it was to light the way, though she never specified for whom or to where. Antonio, remembered by his few relatives, also returned to conversations, followed by the same question that had hovered since 1990. How do two people vanish on the most anticipated day of their lives, leaving behind only the objects that once represented a beginning? The weeks after the discovery were marked by a constant coming and going of people. To the police station, to the riverbank, to the families' homes, the neighborhood, which had grown accustomed to treating the case as an old memory, was now living once more under the weight of unanswered questions. In Brasilia Teimosa, it seemed that every engine rumbling down the street, every unfamiliar face could be connected to that piece of the past that had resurfaced. Local papers ran brief stories. The photo of the suitcase taken at the river's edge showed the faded brown fabric stained green and black, its lid fallen to one side. The caption simply read, "Suitcase found in Tejipio River may be linked to disappearance of couple in 1990. For those who had lived the story, the simplicity of the sentence concealed the weight it carried. Osmar, the fisherman, tried to resume his routine. He went out on his boat every day, but now he noticed lingering glances as he passed the pier. Some stopped him to ask if he had seen anything else unusual. Others, half joking, told him he should look for more treasures in the river. He offered few words in return, preferring to keep his gaze on the water. There was something about the silence of the Tejipio's stones that felt heavier since that morning. Rosaline's mother, for her part, began to receive visitors she hadn't seen in years. Old neighbors, distant relatives, and even strangers came to offer words of comfort or share memories of the couple. One old man recounted that days before the disappearance, Antonio had mentioned that someone at the port had offered him a quick job for the following week. No one could explain what kind of job it was. and the detail was lost among other stories. The police re-interviewed some witnesses, but time had erased important traces. People had moved away, others had died, and the memories of those who remained were muddled. A man thought he remembered a car parked near the alley where Rosaline's shoes were found, but he couldn't be sure of the make or color. A woman swore she had seen a package being thrown into the river that same week in 1990. But she couldn't say if it was connected to the case. Among the oldest residents, the story's reappearance also brought a kind of discomfort. It was as if the entire neighborhood had pried open a drawer it had long preferred to keep shut. The children who hadn't lived through that time began to ask who Rosilene and Antônio were, and the adults found themselves forced to explain without delving into the harshest details. Some avoided speaking of it at night, afraid of summoning bad things, though no one used such superstitious words. At the market, comments mingled with the sound of knives slicing through fish, the smell of cilantro, and the rustle of plastic bags. Maybe it was an accident, and the suitcase just floated until it got stuck, one would say. Or maybe someone put it there on purpose to throw everyone off, another would counter. Each opinion came loaded with gestures and glances, as if there were more behind the words than could be said aloud. In the absence of new facts, only the known pieces remained. The dress, the suit, the shoes, the suitcase. Objects that once symbolized a celebration, now the materialization of a void. The priest of the small downtown church remarked to a parishioner that he still remembered the day he stood waiting at the altar, looking toward the door, trying to imagine a reason for the delay. "Back then, I thought it was just a simple misunderstanding," he said, his slow fingers tracing the beads of his rosary. "Today I see it was already the beginning of the end." Time moved on, but for those who knew the neighborhood well, something had shifted. The banks of the TGBO River seemed more closely watched, as if expecting the water to give something else back. And in the houses with low doors and narrow windows, the story of Rosilene and Antônio ceased to be mere history, becoming an uncomfortable presence in the here and now. A reminder that no matter how hard you try to bury a mystery, it always finds a way to breathe again. Osmar was still sought out to speak about his discovery, but over time he noticed the questions had changed. At first they wanted details of the exact moment he pulled the suitcase from the rocks. Later they began to ask what he thought had happened to the couple. He always repeated the same line: "I only found the suitcase, the rest only God and the river know." It was his way of ending the conversation without committing to any hypothesis. Still, people insisted, as if they expected him to have seen something he hadn't told. At the home of Rosaline's mother, the stream of visitors began to dwindle. The first week after the suitcase was found had been intense, but now only a few of the closest neighbors would stop by. She kept the habit of lighting a candle each night, watching the flame until the wick extinguished itself. Her younger children avoided asking about their sister, knowing that any mention of her name brought a weight that settled in the air. In the neighborhood, the story's reappearance also unearthed memories of other, older disappearances. Unrelated but now connected in people's minds. A fisherman recounted how, years ago, a teenager vanished after heading out to sell shrimp on the street. A seamstress recalled that a friend's daughter disappeared on her way to school, never to be seen again. Each case had its own circumstances, but in the collective imagination it all seemed part of the same grim narrative of absence. The police, pressured by the publicity, issued a statement saying that new lines of investigation were being considered. To the residents, however, it sounded more like a formality than a real promise. The searches in the river had ended with nothing more than the suitcase, and the items were now stored in the police station's evidence room. inside labeled boxes. An employee commented in a low voice that they would likely remain there for years until they deteriorated completely. Meanwhile, some residents tried to weave their own theories. A young man who worked at the port suggested that Antonio might have been lured into a job that day, taking Rosilene with him, and that something went wrong. An old woman claimed the two might have seen something they shouldn't have on their way to the church. Others, more practical, thought it could have been a robbery gone bad, the suitcase with their clothes thrown into the river to erase any trace. None of these hypotheses brought any proof, only tightening the circle of speculation. For Osmar, who used to spend hours on the river in silence, every bend and every stone now carried another dimension. The stretch where he found the suitcase had become a point of observation for the curious. Children would go there with makeshift fishing rods, as if they could fish for another clue. Young people took photos to show their friends, and even people from neighboring districts appeared to see the site of the discovery. To Osmar, it was an unwelcome intrusion. The river, which had always been a place of work and routine, now felt like the set of a story he had never chosen to be a part of. One night, Rosaline's mother confided in a neighbor that she dreamt of her daughter, but in the dreams she never spoke. She would simply appear in the white dress, looking on with a calm gaze. It wasn't a confession made in search of an explanation, but simply a need to unburden herself. The neighbor simply held her hand and stayed there, listening to the distant sound of the waves, mixed with the sound of a radio playing 4-0. By the end of June 2001, routine began to return to what it was before the discovery, at least on the surface. Conversations about the case grew more infrequent, replaced by daily concerns: the rising price of fish, the renovation of the town square, the neighborhood football championship. But all it took was for someone to mention the suitcase, and a silence would fall once more. It was as if everyone knew that without new answers, this was just another open chapter in a story that refused to close. The winter of that year arrived, bringing frequent rains. The dirt roads of Brasilia Teimosa turned into muddy corridors, and the puddles reflected the yellowed lamps of the streetlights. The house of Rosaline's mother took on the smell of damp earth, and the wind that blew in from the sea made the wooden frame creak. She carried on with her routine in slow motion. She would wake early, sweep the packed earth floor, put water to boil on the small stove, and light the candle in the corner of the table. Not a day went by that she didn't look toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in. The suitcase found in the river was no longer on display at the police station. It was kept in the storeroom, along with objects from other forgotten cases. An employee told Osmar that the fabric was rapidly disintegrating and that soon there might be nothing left to preserve. The idea that the last physical link to the couple could be lost was unsettling, but no one knew what to do. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. In the neighborhood, some began to avoid the subject, not from a lack of interest, but from exhaustion. "We talk, and in the end, nothing changes," said a fishmonger at the market while wrapping a kilo of mullet. Others still insisted on revisiting their memories. A man who lived near the port recalled seeing Antonio on the day he disappeared, talking to someone in a parked car, but he couldn't remember the person's face or the color of the vehicle. It was another detail that had arrived too late to be useful. Osmar, despite trying not to get involved, felt something pulling him back to the river. Not to search for more things, but to watch. He would pass by the stretch of rocks almost every day, noticing if the current had brought anything new. He found only branches, pieces of plastic, once even an old tire. None of these objects carried the same weight as the suitcase. Still, every time he saw something caught in the rocks, his heart would race as if he were about to relive that day. The church in the center where the wedding was to have taken place also bore the marks of the story. The priest who had celebrated so many masses and marriages still remembered the couple and how the news of their disappearance arrived as he was preparing the altar. He would sometimes tell the younger parishioners that he had left the candles lit for hours that afternoon, hoping they would appear. Now, more than a decade later, the pew where Rosaline's mother had sat that day was still in the same place, its edges worn smooth by time. A few journalists returned to the neighborhood to produce short pieces on the discovery. They photographed the streets, the river, and tried to interview residents. But the atmosphere of mistrust was strong. Most refused to speak or gave short answers, fearing their words would be twisted. Osmar gave only one interview, repeating his account without adding anything new. He said he didn't want to invent stories on top of someone else's pain. Practical life went on. Children ran through the puddles, splashing water on one another. Women washed clothes in plastic basins, the sound of soap rubbing against fabric mixing with the songs of birds. Men carried sacks and crates at the port, their feet getting wet in the rising tide. But deep down, everyone knew there was something unresolved circulating through the neighborhood. It wasn't just the case of Rosilene and Antônio, it was the feeling that here stories could simply disappear, leaving behind only fragments that time would eventually erode. Osmar, sitting on the wooden bench of his porch, watched the river darken at the end of the afternoon. The smell of wet earth drifted from the opposite bank, and the sound of frogs began to fill the air. He knew that for many, that suitcase was just more proof that you can't control destiny, but for him it was also a silent warning. The river holds secrets, and not all of them are willing to be returned. July brought clear, dry days after weeks of rain. The Tajipio River ran lower, revealing banks that were normally hidden. From a boat, you could see logs caught in the tree roots, remnants of old nets, and even marks on the embankment that looked like makeshift steps. Osmar, though he didn't want to relive the episode with the suitcase, observed these details with a keen eye, as if the river might have more to tell. In the neighborhood, life resumed its usual rhythm, but conversations about Rosilene and Antônio still surfaced at unexpected moments. During a game of dominoes, an old man remarked that he remembered seeing Rosilene at the market the day before the wedding, picking out fruit with a shy smile. Another said that in that same week, Antônio had seemed quieter than usual, as if he had something on his mind. No one could say if these details meant anything, or if they were just memories shaped by time. Rosaline's mother kept the dress her daughter had worn for an impromptu photo shoot days before she disappeared. It was a simple light blue dress with seams that Rosilene herself had sewn. She kept it wrapped in paper inside a cardboard box in the wardrobe. Every now and then, she would open the box to feel the fabric and remember the touch of her daughter's hands. But she did this alone, without mentioning it to anyone else in the house. It was her way of preserving what was left. The police station, after weeks of activity, returned to its usual lull. The suitcase and clothes were catalogued, but no one knew when they would be examined again. An investigator admitted in an informal conversation that, without new leads, the case could go cold again for years. There were no new witnesses, no documents, and the tests on the clothes only confirmed what was already known. They were old pieces damaged by water with no clear marks to indicate how they ended up in the river. Despite this, some of the younger residents organized to create a small mural in the neighborhood with old photos of events and people who had marked the community. Among the images, they placed a copy of a photo of Rosilene and Antônio taken months before the wedding. They were sitting on a sidewalk side by side, smiling discreetly. The photo was protected by a clear plastic sheet, pinned to a piece of wood painted white. The intention was simple, that no one should forget. Osmar began to avoid talking about the discovery in detail. He would say that, to him, the suitcase had probably washed up there by chance, perhaps carried by a flood. But deep down, he didn't quite believe that theory. The way it had been wedged between the rocks with no signs of having been dragged for a long distance still puzzled him. At night, as he listened to the sound of the rising tide lapping against the wooden stilts of his backyard, he would think about the journey that object must have taken to end up in that exact spot. On a Sunday morning, the downtown church held a mass for the intention of disappeared persons. The priest mentioned the names of Rosilene and Antônio, along with other names that few recognized. Rosilene's mother attended, sitting in the same front pew, her hands clasped the entire time. She did not cry, nor did she smile. She simply stared at the altar as if trying to see something that others could not. That week, a television crew tried to film a longer report on the case. They arrived with cameras, microphones, and direct questions. A few people agreed to speak, others walked away. Osmar refused the interview, saying he had already said enough. After they left, the neighborhood returned to its normal pace, but the crew's presence had rekindled the feeling that the story, even without answers, was still alive and perhaps always would be. August arrived, bringing strong winds from the sea. In Brasilia Teimosa, they swept through the narrow streets, kicking up fine dust and rattling the doors of the wooden houses. Life went on as usual, fishermen on the pier, women washing clothes in basins, children chasing after deflated balls. But there was a certain caution in the air whenever the conversation neared the subject of Rosilene and Antônio. After the suitcase, people had learned to measure their words. In the home of Rosilene's mother, the routine remained contained. She would wake early, light her candle, and brew strong black coffee. She didn't speak much about the case, but any visitor who entered noticed the care with which she kept the table set, as if expecting someone at any moment. On the wall, a small portrait of her daughter remained, its frame now peeling. It was the only photo that was always in view. Osmar, more than 2 months after the discovery, felt his relationship with the river had changed. He fished less out of necessity and more out of habit, but every time he passed the stretch of rocks, he would look for a few seconds longer. He never found anything but trash carried by the current, yet the place carried a silent weight. He never told anyone, but some nights he dreamt of the suitcase floating alone, spinning slowly as if trying to return to the surface. Slowly, the community began to weave the story into its emotional landscape. Just as they remembered the floods, the accidental fires, and the unforgettable festivals. The case of Rosilene and Antônio was now woven into the fabric of the town's memory, an event every resident knew by heart. Children born years later could already recount the story in broad strokes, passing on a narrative they had inherited but never lived. In the bars, from time to time, someone would bring up the subject, but the conversation would always trail off, ending with a wave of the hand or a long, slow drink, a sign there was little more to be said. At the church in the center of town, the priest maintained his habit of mentioning the couple in the intentions of the Sunday Mass. He did so briefly but consistently. For him, it was a way of keeping their names from being lost to time. Once after a service, a woman who was not from the neighborhood approached to ask who they were. She left with a solemn expression, as if she were carrying the story home with her. The police station, for its part, showed no signs of a new investigation. The clothes remained in storage. The suitcase was growing more fragile by the day, and there was a possibility it would be discarded if it deteriorated completely. This news, which spread in whispers, angered some, but no one knew how to prevent it. It was the harsh realization that, to the system, old cases without concrete evidence tend to vanish into a bureaucratic void. One late afternoon, Osmar was in his yard mending nets when he saw a group of young people walking toward the river. They were holding their phones, taking pictures of the rocks. One of them asked where exactly the suitcase had been found. Osmar pointed to the spot without offering much detail and returned to his work. He preferred not to feed what he saw as a growing tourist curiosity. This was not an attraction. It was a wound. The wind that night was stronger, carrying the scent of the sea mixed with wet earth from the other bank. In the houses, doors and windows creaked, for those lying awake, trying to sleep. The sound was almost the same as it had been in 1990, when the neighborhood stayed up all night waiting for news that never came. And though no one said it aloud, there was a shared, unspoken feeling that the suitcase from the river would not be the last memory to surface from the past, only the most recent to find its place in the collective consciousness. September brought hot days and clear skies, but a sense of stillness hung over the neighborhood. The case of Rosilene and Antônio was no longer in the newspapers or on television, but it remained alive in the conversations of those who had lived through that morning in 1990. Their names were always spoken in the same low tone, as if speaking any louder might break something that time was trying to preserve. There were no new leads, no visits from the police, but the echo of the suitcase in the river still rippled through the narrow streets. Rosaline's mother, after months of silence, began to visit the church more frequently. She attended the late afternoon masses, always sitting in the same front pew, gazing at the altar in silence. The priest, noticing her constant presence, would leave the nearest candle lit until it burned all the way down. Sometimes she brought simple flowers, daisies or chrysanthemums, and left them in a corner without saying who they were for. Those who saw understood, but no one commented. Osmar, meanwhile, went fishing less often. He spent more time at home, mending nets to sell or trading stories with neighbors at his gate. He avoided talking about his discovery, not out of fear, but because he knew deep down he had nothing new to add. When someone insisted, he would offer short answers before steering the conversation to other topics. The river, however, remained part of his routine. He walked to its bank almost every day, like someone visiting an old acquaintance. Stories began to circulate through the neighborhood, a mix of fact and speculation. Someone claimed to have heard that a man now living in another city might know more about the day of the disappearance. Another mentioned that a boat seen at the time belonged to a sailor who vanished shortly after. These conversations spread quickly but died just as fast, because no one ever presented any proof. It was as if the case had become a puzzle with pieces that would never fit. The children who once ran curiously to the stretch of rocks were now absorbed in other games. The adults, however, still passed by and cast a sidelong glance as if expecting to find something. Some people began to avoid the place at night, not from any physical fear, but from the discomfort of being so close to where a piece of their history had washed ashore. The mood in the community shifted between resignation and restlessness. Some argued they should stop talking about the case to spare the families more sorrow. Others believed that silence would only hasten the forgetting. In the midst of it all, life went on. Boats arrived with fresh fish at dawn. The smell of coffee filled the kitchens, and laundry swayed on the line in the breeze. But all it took was a mention of the suitcase, the dress, or the suit, and everything would slow down as if time itself had taken a step back. One evening, Rosaline's mother was walking home after Mass. She passed the alley where the shoes had been found 11 years earlier. She stopped for a few seconds, looked at the worn concrete, and then continued on without a word. To anyone who saw her, it was just a silent gesture. To her, it was revisiting a fixed point on her timeline, a landmark that could not be erased, no matter how hard she tried. That same night, Osmar sat on his porch and watched the river reflect the distant lights. He felt that, although the search was over, the case was still breathing. Perhaps nothing more would ever come to the surface. Perhaps it would all remain at the bottom forever. But he knew, as everyone in the neighborhood knew, that the story of Rosilene and Antônio would never truly be gone. Even if it was only a memory told when the conversation grows quiet and the night falls. October of 2001 marked 11 years since the day Rosilene and Antônio left to get married and disappeared along the way. There was no ceremony, no special mass, no anniversary feature in the news. There was only the silent remembrance that haunted the community. For Rosilene's mother, every detail of that day remained vivid. The dress, altered by the light of a lantern, the makeshift bouquet from the yard. Her daughter's quick smile before she walked out the door. Time hadn't erased these things, it had sealed them in layers. On the morning of the 12th, she went to the church alone. She sat in the front pew, lit a candle, and stared at the altar. She didn't ask for answers, didn't make any vows. She just sat there as if her presence itself was an act of resistance. The priest greeted her with a discreet nod, respecting her silence. On her way out, she passed the alley where the shoes had been left. The ground looked different now, but the memory was the same. Clean shoes side by side, as if placed there with care. On that same day, Osmar went to the river early. Not to fish, but to watch the tide. The stretch of rocks was partially submerged, and nothing caught among them drew his eye. He stood for a few minutes, listening to the sound of the current, and then headed home. He knew the suitcase hadn't solved the mystery. It had only returned a piece of it to the surface. But he also understood that in places like this, sometimes that was all you could ever hope for. Fragments. The neighborhood followed its rhythm. Children came and went from school. Boats docked at the pier. Vendors called out their wares at the market. And yet, there were moments when the story would emerge from nowhere. A neighbor would mention she'd dreamed of Rosilene. A childhood friend of Antonio's would recall a soccer game they played together. They were small fissures in the present through which the past would seep. As night fell, Rosilene's mother lit a candle in her kitchen. She watched the flame flicker in the breeze that slipped through the cracks. Perhaps no one would ever know what happened. Perhaps the river had taken everything but the memory, and that memory, however heavy, was all that was left to keep the couple alive in the neighborhood. Osmar, sitting on his porch, watched the lights reflecting on the water and thought of what he had said so many times. I only found the suitcase, the rest only the river knows. The sound of the waves blended with the distant murmur of the city, and so, between the sea, the river, and the narrow streets, the story of Rosilene and Antônio endured. Not as a solved case, but as part of the identity of those who live there. If you have come this far and want more stories like this to be told with respect and attention to detail, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and send it to those who value memories that cannot be lost. This is how we keep alive the names, the places, and the questions that time has not yet answered.